Chapter 12. The ambulance bells had long died away into memory when three men came strolling along the Ealing road. One was bowed and ancient, walking with the aid of a slim ebony cane, a mane of snow-white hair trailing out behind him. Another was tall and gaunt, with a great hawk of a nose, clad in an oddly Victorian tweed suit. As to the last, he was Irish and wanted his 30 quid. As these three approached the Swan, Sherlock Holmes suddenly laid a gentle palm upon the Professor's chest and said, "Now what do you make of that?" Professor Slocum shook his old head. "Cellar doors ajar, a barman somewhat remiss in his duties." "Oh no," said Holmes. "Much more, and what here?" The elder perused Leo's defunct tow truck parked at the curb, its back axle supported by two piles of red flettons. "Unusual bravado upon the part of the local criminal fraternity," he suggested. "I think not." Holmes drew out his magnifying glass, and, as Omally watched him, with one eye forever straying towards the saloon bar door, he dropped to all fours and perused the pavement. "How many entrances to this cellar?" asked Holmes, looking up. "Just that," said Omally, "and a door behind the bar." "I see." Holmes examined the blackened skid marks. "Interesting," said he. "Riveting," said John. "Might we step inside now, please?" Holmes rose to his feet and patted dust from his trouser knees. "I think so," he said. Omally led the way, and the three men entered the bar. Pooley, who with old Pete's aid had long ago finished the bottle of Neville's Reserve, rose unsteadily to greet them. Omally eyed them with great suspicion. "Have you seen soap this morning?" he asked. Pooley shook his head. "You've missed all the excitement." "Obviously. Who's round at it?" "I'll get these," said Professor Slocum. "Holmes?" "A small sherry," the detective replied, "and a small word with Mr. Pooley here." "Oh, yes?" asked the half-drunken Jim. "The fellow with the beard serving behind the bar is not, I believe, the regular barman." Pooley squinted disgustedly towards Crowton, the pot-bellied potman, who was now up to his elbows in froth behind the beer engines. "Certainly not," said he. "And the regular barman, a gentleman of some standing in this community, he is not one who would leave the bar during a lunchtime session without a very good reason. Not Neville. So I would be right, then, in assuming that the fat gentleman who was until recently stuck fast in a cellar opening outside was this very Neville." "Do what?" said John Omally. "What happened here, Jim?" "I'll do my best to explain," said Pooley, tumbling backwards from his bar stool. "But for now, I think I'll need to go to the toilet." It was quite some time before Pooley re-emerged, looking a little more sober. During the period of his absence, Holmes had gleaned all the necessary information from other sources, finished his sherry, and had taken himself off to places elsewhere. Jim relocated his behind upon the bar stool. Looking up at the battered Guinness clock, he asked, "Anybody know what won the 145?
"Every man boy," said old Pete. "I get free radio Brentford on my death aid. The commentator was having a corny by the sound of it."
Pooley struggled a moment to comprehend this intelligence. Slowly he withdrew his betting slip and peered between his fingers at his selection. "By the gods," said he. "Did you hear the starting price?"
66 to 1, old Pete replied. "A quid or two there for the outside better."
Pooley spread his betting slip before him on the bar counter. "I am 66 quid in the black," said he. Omally peered over his shoulder. "Then order me a pint of froth quickly then, Jimmy boy," said he. "I suppose there's no chance that was your only bet of the afternoon." "Actually, no," said Jim. "I have an accumulator here." "A 4-horse Yankee?" "No, a 6-horse Super Yankee." "I give my own then." "Nobody has any faith in me whatever," Jim told Professor Slocum.
"No?"
The old man shook his head in wonder.
"Then let me at least get you another drink in. Are you feeling a little better now?"
"A temporary lapse," said Jim. "Your man from below puts the wind up me more than a little."
"The 2 o'clock's on," said old Pete. "Got one in here, Jim?"
Pooley nodded. "Lucifer lad."
Want to listen?
Old Pete took out his deaf ear and turned up the volume. The Mickey Mouse voice of the commentator tinkled out the race as three men, at least, knotted their fists and offered up with small sounds of encouragement for the game outsider. Lucifer Lad romped home at 66-1. My brain's gone, said Pooley. Can anybody work it out?
You don't want to think about it, Jim, said the professor. Let us just say that is a goodly sum.
How goodly? Tell me.
£4,356.
They brought Jim round with the contents of the soda siphon. Jim, said John, drawing him up by the lapels. Now wake up. What kind of deal have you done with Bob?
The 6-host special, as ever, mumbled Pooley. 6 winners or nothing.
You buffoon! Omally threw up his hands. If you'd had another winner, you'd get a percentage even with a couple more seconds or thirds. You'd be £1,000 in profit now. There is no such thing as a 6-horse Super Yankee. Such things are myths. In ITV7 there is. That bookies laugh at as they fly off to their holidays in the Seychelles. Give me that slip. Pooley pushed it across the counter. Anybody got a paper? Pooley brought his out. Did you pay the tax? Pooley nodded. You blessed buffoon. Tell me again how rich I am, said Jim, just so I can hear it. Omally dutifully worked it out on his fingers. By the time he had finished, old Pete said,
The 2.15's on.
Bob the bookie was enjoying a most unpleasant lunch at the Bonnie Pit Lad in Chiswick. The tenant of this dire establishment, who, as a result of some major brainstorm, had convinced himself that mining pubs were going to be the next big thing, had borrowed a considerable sum from Bob to transform the place from a late Victorian money spinner to a Corpheus catastrophe. The pit props and stuffed ponies, the stark wooden benches and coal dust floor had provided strangely uninviting to the Chiswick drinking fraternity. Even in those winter months, when lit by the cosy glow of davy lamps, there was at least a good fire burning in the hearth. Bob the bookie had of course extended the tenant's credit to the point that he now owned the controlling interest in the place. The plans for the luxury steakhouse it was shortly to become were already drawn up and in his safe. As he sat alone in the deserted bar devouring his snap, Bob pondered upon what far-flung tropical beach he might park his $1 million bum at the weekend. Antoine the chauffeur entered the bar in a flash of white livery, bearing upon a silver platter the computer printout of the latest racing update just received through the Latinos and Romith in-car teleprinter. The telex message that Jim Pooley, through merit of his win in the 2.15, was now £284,196 up, put the definite kibosh on the apple crumble end of Bob's Cornish pasty. You damnable blessed buffoon, went John Omally. You'd be rich, you bally big bonkers, damnable blessed buffoon. It hasn't changed me, said Jim. I'm still your friend. Lend me a pound and I'll get them in.
Are we all aboard for the 2.30? asked old Pete. What is your selection, Jim?
7 seals. Pooley checked his slip.
66-1,
said old Pete. Omally pressed his hands to his temples. I just knew he was going to say that, he groaned. Exactly how 7 seals, who had been running a very poor 18th, actually managed to catch up and overtake the favourite in the last 6 furlongs was a matter for experts in that particular field to ponder upon for many moons yet to come. You're definitely ahead now, said John Omally. I make that £18,756,936 at the very last. A tidy sum I would call that. Let me never quit, Pooley pleaded. I think I'd like to buy a cigar. As he steered Bob the bookie's roller through the crush of lunchtime traffic in the Chiswick High Road, Antoine the chauffeur leafed through the situations vacant column of the Brentford Mercury. Bob sat quivering in the back, shaken from head to toe, his knuckles jammed into his mouth. The in-car teleprinter punched out the runners for the 2.45. There it was, Millennium Choice at 66-1, and the runners coming under starters' orders. Bob punched away at his golden calculator, but the thing merely rang up no sale and switched itself off in disgust. Do I get any redundancy money? Antoine inquired politely.
They're off,
bawled old Pete. The Swan's crowd knotted its fists and shook them in time to Mickey's little voice. Cries of encouragement were obviously out of the question, as to hear anything of the race required a great deal of breath-holding and ear-straining. But the patrons went about this with a will, their faces like so many gargoyles, veins straining upon temples, and sweat trickling through the brill-creamed forelocks. They took up the universal stance of punters, legs apart, knees slightly bent, bums protruding, and chins to the fore. They were phantom jockeys to a man, riding upon the commentator's every word. Nerves were cranking themselves into the red sector. Millennium Choice was laying a not altogether favourable sixth in the six-horsed race. "Come on, man!" screamed Omally, who could stand it no longer. His outcry breached the dam, and the flood tide hit the valley floor. "Go on, my son, give him some stick. The whip, man, use the whip. Dig your heels in. Millennium, 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 millennium." The voices tumbled one upon another, rising to a deafening cacophony. Old Pete snatched up his hearing aid and rammed it back into his ear. If the entire pub had decided to go off its head, he felt no reason why he, at least, should be deprived of the result. Bob the Bookie's roller was jammed up at the Chiswick roundabout, but his Latanos and Romith VistaVision portable television was working okay. As Millennium Choice swept past the post, a clear 6 lengths ahead of the field, Antoine calmly drew a red circle about a likely vacancy. Bob looked up towards the flyover, soaring away into the distance.
"I'll have to sell it," he thought. "Who won it? Who won it? Who won it?"
The Swan's lunchtime crowd engulfed old Pete.
"Out with it!"
The ancient raised his thumb.
"You're round, I think, Jim."
The crowd erupted and stormed the bar. Crowton, the pot-bellied popman, took to his heels and fled. Omally laboured at his exercise book. "I can't work it out," said he, tearing out great tufts of hair. "Professor, please!" The old man, who had worked it out in his head, wrote £1,237,957,776.
"I think your day has also come, John,"
he said, indicating the vacancy behind the bar counter. Omally thrust his exercise book in front of the golden boy and shinned over the counter to realise his own lifetime's dream. He was a natural at the pumps, and the clawing, snapping human hydra was rapidly quelled. "When the sixth horse goes down, nobody will ever speak to me again," the back-patted Jim told the professor. "5 offers of marriage I have had already."
"Perk up," the scholar replied. "I know the odds are unthinkable, but I have a feeling just the same."
Omally stuffed a pint of large into each of Pooley's outstretched hands. "What again, this, Dan?" said he. "You will hate me also," Pooley replied dismally. "Me?" Omally pressed his hands to his heart. "But I love you, my dearest friend, the brother I never had." "You have 5 brothers." "None like you." Jim considered his 2 pints and raised both simultaneously to his lips. It was a kind of feat no man could be expected to perform twice in a lifetime, but he drained the 2 at a single draught. "Oh, cruel fate," he said, wiping the merest drip from his chin.
"Tell me, Jim,"
Professor Slocum asked, as a crowd of female kissers took turns at their hero's cheek,
"how did you do it? Was it the product of pure chance, or through the study of form? I ask out of professional interest. I can assure you that it will go no further."
Jim brushed away the barmaid from the New Inn, whose arm had snaked about his waist. "If you really want to know, it was down to you and your talk of numerology. Find the pattern, you said. Break everything down to its numerological equivalent, you said, and the answer is yours." Professor Slocum nodded enthusiastically. A light shone in his old face.
"Yes, yes," he cried. "Then you have solved it. You have found the key. Tell me, Jim, I must know."
"It wasn't all that," Jim replied. "Get off there, woman. These are private places. I simply followed the lines."
"The lines? What lines?"
Pooley pushed his racing paper towards the professor. "Those boys there," he said. "Madam, put those hands away." Professor Slocum drew a quivering finger across the row of computer lines. 18 in all, 3 groups of 6.
"Oh, my lord," he said slowly. "Jim, do you realise what you've done?"
Pulled off the big one.
"Very much more than that."
Professor Slocum thumbed the paper back to its front page.
"I knew it. This is not your paper."
I borrowed it, said Jim guiltily.
Jim, tear up the slip. I am not joking. You don't understand what you've got yourself into. Tear it up now. I implore you.
Leave it out, Jim Pooley replied.
I will write you a cheque.
The Professor pulled out his chequebook.
Name the sum.
Easter Majesty. Pooley turned to old Pete, who was banging his deaf aid onto the bar counter.
I've gone deaf here,
the other replied.
Jim, the Professor implored. Listen, please.
Pete, said Pooley, you old fool, give me that thing. 3 o'clock was fast approaching upon the Guinness clock. Switch her on then, said somebody, nudging old Pete upon the arm. Now, it must be fairly stated that Pete's hearing aid was not one of those microchipped miracle appliances one reads so much of in the popular press. Such articles, one is so informed, although no bigger than a garden pea, can broadcast the sound of a moth breaking wind to the massed appreciation of an entire Wembley Cup-tie crowd. No, old Pete's contraption was not one of these. Here instead you had the valve, the pink Bakelite case, and the now totally expended tungsten carbide battery.
It's broke, said old Pete. Kaput. It's what? Pardon, the elder replied. You'll have to speak up. My deaf aid's gone.
Deaf aid's gone. Deaf aid's gone. The words spread like marge on a muffin. The panic spread with it.
Tear up the slip,
the Professor commanded, his words lost in the growing din. Pooley clutched it to his bosom as the threatened firstborn it was. Omally sought Neville's knobkery as the crowd turned into a mob and sought a beam to throw a rope over. It was lynching time in Brentford. Having seen active service in many a foreign field, old Pete was well prepared to go down fighting. He swung his stick with ninja fury at the first likely skull that loomed towards him. Friend or foe wasn't in it. Fists began to fly. Omally, knobkery in hand, launched himself from the counter into the middle of the crowd. "On to the bookies, Jim!" he shouted. He brought down a dozen rioters. Sheltering his privy parts and clinging for dear life to his betting slip, Pooley, in the wake of Professor Slocum, whom no man present would have dared strike, no matter how dire the circumstances, edged through the melee. "He's getting away!" yelled someone, struggling up from beneath the mad Irishman. "After him, lads!" The crowd swung in a blurry mass towards the saloon bar door, through which Pooley was now passing with remarkable speed. The tumbling mass burst out after him onto the street. Professor Slocum stepped nimbly aside and took himself off to business elsewhere. Leo Felix, who had been labouring away with welder's blowtorch in a vain attempt to salvage anything of his defunct torch rock, stared up, white-faced and dreading, as Pooley blundered into him. "Aye and aye," squealed the rattled Rastaman, vanishing away between a small Mount Zion of bowling bodies. Jim was snatched up by a dozen flailing hands and raised shoulder high. The stampede turned into a thundering phalanx, which lurched forward, bound for Bob the bookies, bearing at their vanguard their multi-million-dollar standard. Jim prepared to make a deal with God for the second time in as many days. When the sixth horse floundered, as surely it must, Mr. Popular he was not going to be. "Father, forgive them," he said. Antoine turned Bob's roller into the Ealing Road with an expensive shriek of burning rubber. Ahead, the advancing phalanx filled the street. Antoine yanked hard upon the wheel, but the car appeared to have ideas of its own. It tore forward into the crowd, scattering bodies to left and right. Jim cartwheeled forward and came to rest upon the gleaming bonnet, his nose jammed up against the windscreen. The roller mounted the pavement, bringing down a lamp-post and mercifully dislodging Jim, who slid into the gutter, a gibbering wreck, bereft of yet another jacket sleeve, which now swung to and fro upon a gold-plated windscreen wiper, like some captured tribal war trophy. Antoine leapt from the cab as Pooley's sixth horse kicked betting history into a cocked hat, and Bob's roller plunged onward, bound for the rear of Leo's tow truck and the blowtorch, which was even now blazing away at the unattended oxyacetylene gas bottle beneath it.
"It's been a funny old kind of day," said Bob the bookie.